What's up, investors? It's the Russian dude. If you thought Russia's obsession with empire ended with Ukraine, well, think again. We all heard about Putin's ambitions spreading towards Europe, specifically Baltic countries. But what about Russia's supposed best friend, Belarus? Yes, the same loyal sidekick who lent Russia its territory to storm Kiev in the opening days of the war, who pushed the Russian propaganda when no one else would, who has spent decades serving as Moscow's obedient little brother. Think Putin will always be grateful to Lukashenko for all he did? You think Putin owes him something even? Under normal circumstances, however normal you can call them, yes, one president will be at least thankful. But the problem here is that Putin owes nothing to nobody. It is Putin who collects the favors from other leaders and then gives absolutely nothing in return except just some future promises. We will do this, we will do that, and he never does. And so combining interviews of some discarded Russian politicians, some internal Kremlin rumors, independent and opposition media reports, it is not without a zero probability that within next 5 to 10 years, Belarus is not supposed to exist as an independent state anymore according to the Kremlin. What's the alleged plan? Strip it of sovereignty piece by piece. Politics, economy, education, history, even if it's national identity, until it becomes nothing but another Russian province with just a different accent. And then, officially integrated as a part of Russia. And this is not some wild conspiracy theory. This is spelled out in black and white, courtesy of Putin's own executive office. A blueprint of betrayal. A manual for dissolving a nation. Because that's exactly what he has been trying to do in Ukraine since 2014. And when he thought the country was ready for becoming Russia, the final step, 3-day invasion, has been initiated. The rest is history. Was Russia invading Ukraine a conspiracy theory at some point in the past? Well, absolutely. Not too many people believed it, even when the tanks were literally next to the border. And now look what happened. Belarus, on the other hand, after all the loyalty it has shown, is being lined up for a fate worse than Ukraine. Because at least Ukraine chose resistance, while Belarus is being strangled slowly under the disguise of friendship. So why is Putin willing to gut his most dependable ally? Because his empire is crumbling, his circle of friends is shrinking, and his delusions are metastasizing. Long word, but yeah. Belarus is highly likely next in line for the imperial blender, and what makes it worse is that it's all happening in slow motion under everyone's noses. So today, let's dissect how Russia first courted Belarus with flattery, then exploited it in Ukraine, and then prepared to stab it in the back, and why the Belarusian people themselves may and should be the final roadblock standing in Putin's way. At first glance, Belarus and Russia look inseparable. They share same borders, language, Soviet past, and even the same taste in authoritarian leadership. Belarusian dictator Alexander Lukashenko has been in Putin's orbit for decades, surviving only because of Moscow's lifeline. In 2020 and 25, when Lukashenko blatantly rigged his re-election, just like many other times before that, his people poured into the streets calling for his resignation. Western leaders declared him illegitimate, his own citizens wanted him gone. So who kept him afloat? Putin, of course. Russian security services swooped in to prop up Lukashenko's collapsing rule. It was the political equivalent of life support. Without Moscow, Lukashenko would have been thrown out like yesterday's trash. That is the thing. This bromance was never between equals. Lukashenko depended on Russia for survival, while Putin saw him just as a mere pawn. When the invasion of Ukraine started, Belarus was immediately brought in. Russian troops streamed across the Belarusian border, using it as a staging ground to reach Kiev in days. The alliance was sold as proof of eternal brotherhood. In reality, Belarus was the expendable launchpad for Moscow's failing blitzkrieg. But here's the twist. Lukashenko, for all his weaknesses, drew a red line. He allowed Russian troops to invade from his soil, but refused to send his own army into Ukraine. Again and again, Putin demanded Belarusian boots on the ground. Again and again, Lukashenko stalled, promising just 3 more weeks of thinking every time and then 3 more weeks of thinking. That stalling was not laziness, it was self-preservation, because the moment Belarusian soldiers started coming home in body bags, his fragile regime would implode overnight. And let's not forget, Belarus is not a massive country. With just 9.3 million people, every military loss would ripple across the entire society. Unlike Russia, which can bury statistics under propaganda and still scrape together men from Siberia, Belarus simply cannot afford to lose thousands without shaking its very foundation. That is why Lukashenko keeps dancing around Putin's demands, stringing him along while desperately hoping the war somehow mysteriously resolves by itself before he is forced to commit. The irony is brutal here. Belarus is trapped in a toxic relationship where saying yes means losing independence and saying no means losing power and maybe even your freedom and life. But that is the price you have to pay for being friends with Putin. Before the war started and during its first months, Putin and Lukashenko were inseparable, appearing on the screen together and visiting each other countries almost weekly, it felt like at least. But then the reality kicked in. When was the last time we even saw Putin and Lukashenko together? Pretty good question. Well, that's right. Putin's mask started to slowly slip off. So let's talk about this in our next chapter. From the earliest days of the war, Russia's intentions towards Belarus were obvious. If you are paying attention, during the chaotic march on Kiev, some Russian tanks were spotted flying Belarusian flags instead of Russian ones. The idea was pretty simple, as you would imagine already, but sinister. Trick Ukraine into thinking that Belarus had joined the war, bait Kiev into retaliating, and then drag Belarusians into the conflict against their will, officially. I mean, imagine the setup. Ukraine responding in self-defense, Belarus suddenly branded as enemy, and then just Putin smiling somewhere in the background as its ally took the hit. But Russia did not stop at swapping flags. Then in March 2022, just 1 month after war started, Ukrainian officials reported that Russian forces fired on Belarusian villages from Ukrainian soil, hoping to stage a false flag attack. Later, Russian convoys were seen near the border with vehicles disguised as Ukrainian units, settling the stage for another manufactured incident. And these were not isolated events. This was not one-time things. They were calculated attempts to force Belarus into the war so Moscow could exploit its weaknesses later. But why? Not because Belarus has some super army hidden in the forests. With just 65,000 reportedly active soldiers, Belarus military is barely a dent comparing to Russia's 1.115 million. At current rate, entire Belarusian military will disappear in Ukraine in just under 2 months. Entire military, 2 months. Instead, what Belarus offers is geography, symbolism, and most importantly, a pathway to annexation. The Kremlin's blueprint is absolutely identical to what is happening right now in Ukraine. Lure Belarus into chaos, weaken its institutions, and present annexation as the only possible way forward. The tanks flying Belarusian flags were not just a battlefield trick, they were a preview of Russia's plan to erase Belarusian independence and call it a destiny. I mean, just think about it. If Ukraine had fallen for the bait and attacked Belarus, the narrative would have been set. Ukraine would have fallen straight into Putin's trap. Belarus is victim, Ukraine is aggressor, Russia is savior, and Putin is this white knight protector swooping in to shield his little brother. All the while, Belarusian sovereignty would vanish under the pretense of unity. That is the evil genius of Putin's deception. It does not just rewrite reality, it manufactures it, and then works extra hard to make the world believe that this reality is the only truth. But could the blueprint for silent takeover of Belarus be at least a little bit different from Ukrainian? Let's try to answer this question in our next chapter. The Belarusian blueprint is as revealing as it is terrifying. It does not talk about tanks or nukes. Instead, it outlines a slow motion behind-the-scenes takeover. Step 1. Infiltrate Belarusian politics with pro-Russian loyalists while undermining pro-independent voices. Happening right now. Step 2. Tie Belarus economy to Moscow's. No tariffs, tax-free zones, easy borders, link electricity grids, align currencies, and hand out Russian passports like candy for whoever is willing to take them for free. No pressure. For now. Kinda happening right now as well. Not that much, but just a little bit. Step 3. Rewrite history, literally. Create a common interpretation of history, where Belarusians and Russians share the same narrative. Translation, just simply scrub away Belarusian identity and replace it with the Moscow imperial fairy tale. Then replace history books in schools and universities and voila, pretty much done. next generation is gonna be ready. After all, even the name of the country itself, Belarus, is literally translated as White Russia. If all this sounds a little bit too familiar, it is because it is not new. Russia used the same playbook in Georgia, handing out passports in breakaway regions and then crying about marginalized Russian citizens weren't wanted to invade. It used it in Crimea also, where passports and propaganda were the pretext for annexation. It is now trying to do exactly the same in the east and then the south of Ukraine, some regions. Belarus is just the next domino in this whole chain. The goal is not to help Belarusians, it is to force them into submission without even firing a shot. And if coercion doesn't work, well, there is always the protection narrative. Once enough Belarusians hold Russian passports, the Kremlin can claim it has a duty to defend its people. Never mind that it created the situation in the first place. It is a rigged game designed to make annexation look like a salvation. Let's pause here for a second and, no, not for any promotions or anything, because what I'm about to say is what matters. Belarus is not Ukraine. Ukraine had a tradition of resistance, a growing sense of national pride, and a westward tilt. Belarus under Lukashenko has been stagnating under dictatorship for decades. This makes it much more vulnerable for Russian manipulation. The Kremlin is not planning to roll tanks through Minsk. It is planning to suffocate Belarus until breathing independently feels impossible, until annexation feels like the only path to survival. That is not conquest in the old style. It is imperialism in a business suit with a big, almost sincere smile on the face. But here is where Putin's grand design hits the wall. The Belarusian people themselves. Lukashenko may be a puppet, but his citizens are not. Polls show that nearly 80% of Belarusians oppose sending troops to Ukraine. Barely 3% would personally fight alongside Russians. Many see Ukraine as a brother nation, not as an enemy. Some have gone even further, sabotaging railway lines to block Russian supply chains. Others have crossed the border to even join Ukraine to fight directly. So many volunteered that an entire Belarusian battalion was formed, dedicated to defending Kiev, the same city Russia tried to attack with tanks pretending to be Belarusian. This is not just symbolic, it is existential. Belarusians know that if their army enters the war, their independence is finished. They are caught between a dictator propped up by Moscow and the Kremlin determined to erase them altogether. And yet, from the ground up, they are pushing back through sabotage, resistance, and solidarity with Ukraine. And let's not underestimate what this means. Every Belarusian who derails a train, every student who refuses to buy into Russian propaganda, every volunteer who joins Ukraine's defense chips away at Putin's plan. Lukashenko might stall for selfish reasons, but ordinary Belarusians stall for survival. They have seen what happened in Crimea, they have seen what happened in Donbass, and they know exactly what annexation looks like. For them, siding with Ukraine is not just about brotherhood, it's about staying alive as a nation. For Lukashenko then, the clock is ticking. His presidency survives only because Putin allows it. Without Russians backing it, he faces the fury of his own people. But with the Kremlin's support, he faces the risk of becoming the grave digger of Belarusian sovereignty. Either way, the walls are closing in, and Putin, trapped in his fantasy of rebuilding the Soviet Empire, does not care if his last loyal ally burns in the process. But history has a cruel way of backfiring on tyrants. Just as Putin's invasion of Ukraine united NATO, just as his lies exposes Russia's weaknesses to the world, his betrayal of Belarus may awaken a nation long suffocated under dictatorship. In trying to absorb Belarus, Putin may finally push its people to fight not only for Ukraine, but for their own freedom. Well, there you have it, guys. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe to my channel for more videos like this. If you wish to support our work, there are links down below, for example, Patreon memberships, where you can get an additional chapter in the end. Thanks much for watching. See you tomorrow.
We won't succumb to their tricks, the facade they try to sell. Their twisted words and feeble claims on us all they cannot quell. We see through their lies, their feeble attempts to sway. We do not believe in ridiculous Russian propaganda.